the separation of powers, and the parasitic influence of inflation in a democracy. Introduction: the role of separation of powers in a democracy. The separation of powers is a fundamental principle in democratic governance. It ensures that no single branch of government, executive, legislative, or judicial, holds absolute power. Instead, each branch checks and balances the others, preserving individual freedoms and preventing tyranny. The separation of powers is essential for maintaining stability in a democracy, but it also influences the economic framework of society, especially in relation to wealth distribution and debt. However, when economic policies are driven by inflationary practices, the stability of democracy can be undermined by a parasitic force that erodes societal values and cognitive resilience. This essay explores the relationship between democratic governance, wealth, and the parasitic influence of inflation on society, arguing that inflation serves as a tool for wealth redistribution at the expense of societal morality, stability, and human cognition. The separation of powers and wealth distribution. A key purpose of democratic institutions is to mitigate the concentration of wealth and power. The separation of powers serves as a safeguard against economic exploitation by ensuring that decisions impacting wealth distribution are subject to legislative scrutiny, judicial fairness, and executive oversight. However, modern democracies are often shaped by monetary policies that prioritize economic growth through inflationary measures. These policies are typically justified as a way to stimulate the economy, but they also perpetuate a system of debt accumulation that disproportionately impacts the lower and middle classes. In this way, the very structure that is meant to protect the people from exploitation, democracy, becomes a mechanism through which economic inequality deepens. Inflation acts as a hidden tax, eroding the value of savings and wages, while benefiting those with access to capital and credit. This process resembles a form of classicalism, where the wealthy consume the labor and resources of the working class through invisible economic mechanisms. Inflation as a parasitic influence on society. Inflation is often seen as a natural part of economic growth, but its hidden consequences are far more insidious. It functions as a parasitic force that preys on time, slowly eroding the financial stability of individuals and society as a whole. Inflation creates a quicksand effect, a society caught in a debt spiral, sinking deeper with each passing year. As inflation increases, the cost of living rises, wages fail to keep pace, and individuals are forced to take on more debt to maintain their standard of living. This perpetual cycle leads to a debt-driven society, where economic freedom is eroded, and people are trapped in a system that consumes their time, energy, and spirit. Socialist policies often rely on inflation to fund public programs and redistribute wealth. However, these policies inadvertently prey on time, using inflation as a tool to slow the quicksand of debt without addressing its root causes. While this may provide short-term relief, it ultimately deepens the debt spiral, leading to long-term societal decay. The moral and cognitive decay of society. The parasitic influence of inflation extends beyond economics, impacting the morality, values, and cognitive abilities of a society. As individuals become more focused on survival in an inflationary economy, they lose sight of higher moral and philosophical pursuits. This shift leads to a decline in societal boundaries and an erosion of values that once held communities together. Inflation-induced stress affects cognitive function, reducing the capacity for critical thinking and long-term planning. People become trapped in short-term thinking, driven by immediate financial concerns rather than long-term goals or ethical considerations. This cognitive decay weakens democratic institutions, as citizens become less engaged in civic life and more susceptible to manipulation by those in power. Furthermore, the pursuit of material wealth in an inflationary society often leads to moral decay, as individuals prioritize personal gain over community welfare. This erosion of values creates a society driven by self-interest, where traditional boundaries of right and wrong are blurred. As societal norms collapse, so too does the trust that underpins democratic governance. The debt spiral, a tool of control. The debt spiral created by inflation serves as a tool of control, keeping individuals and societies dependent on the financial system. Debt becomes a form of modern servitude, limiting individuals' freedom and choices. In this context, inflation acts as a mechanism of control, allowing those in power to maintain their position while the majority of society sinks further into financial instability. This spiral not only affects individuals, but also weakens democratic institutions, as governments become beholden to financial markets and creditors. The separation of powers intended to protect democracy is compromised when economic policies are dictated by financial elites rather than elected representatives. Conclusion: the need for economic reform. The separation of powers within a democracy is essential for maintaining stability and protecting individual freedoms. However, when inflation becomes a tool of economic policy, it undermines these principles by creating a debt-driven society that preys on the time, energy, and morality of its citizens. To combat this parasitic influence, democratic societies must pursue economic reforms that address the root causes of inflation and wealth inequality. These reforms should prioritize financial education, debt reduction, and monetary policies that promote long-term stability rather than short-term gains. Without these changes, the quicksand of inflation will continue to erode the foundations of democratic governance, leading to the decay of societal values, cognitive resilience, and ultimately, the human spirit. The true measure of democracy's success lies not in its ability to grow wealth, but in its capacity to preserve the dignity, freedom, and moral integrity of its people. The collapse of the financial system and the testing of the human spirit. When the financial system collapses, as it inevitably must when built on a foundation of inflation-driven debt, society reaches a critical juncture. In this moment of crisis, the scrutiny of the human populace is tested, revealing both the fragility of democratic institutions and the resilience of human morality. The people, stripped of illusions, demand immediate reform. Yet those in power, the architects of the collapsing system, seek to suppress dissent through narrative control, perpetuating a myth that the collapse was both unavoidable and necessary. This narrative of inevitability is profoundly dangerous. It masks the failures of the system and justifies continued exploitation, claiming to be profound in its insights, while being profoundly profane in its disregard for human dignity. In this distance between truth and falsehood, a new timeline emerges. A moment in history where humanity must choose between succumbing to despair or seeking genuine renewal. The emergence of a self-perpetuating narrative. In times of societal collapse, narratives become tools of control. The elites who once masked their power through economic structures now weaponize stories to maintain their dominance. These narratives are carefully constructed to appear as alternatives to the truth, yet they are designed to fold back upon themselves, perpetuating the very system they claim to critique. This self-perpetuating narrative becomes a loop, a cycle of promises and betrayals that traps the populace in a state of cognitive dissonance. The people are offered reforms that never materialize, progress that never arrives, and freedom that remains out of reach. The narrative is so deeply embedded that it continues to brainwash the populace, directing their energy toward meaningless pursuits while the true levers of power remain untouched. The Gnostic manipulation of society. The architects of this narrative, the Gnostic elite, believe themselves to be divine in their knowledge. They see themselves as enlightened, holding secret truths that justify their dominance. Their narrative is not one of open discourse or democratic ideals, but of hidden wisdom and esoteric control. They manipulate symbols, language, and institutions to shape reality according to their desires. This Gnostic influence leads to a profound distortion of reality. The populace is led to believe that salvation lies in submission to the system, that their suffering is part of a grand cosmic plan. In truth, this narrative is a parasitic construct, designed to keep society in a perpetual state of debt, dependency, and despair. These elites, believing themselves to be godlike in their wisdom, fail to see that their own narrative is a prison, one that traps both the rulers and the ruled in a cycle of moral decay and spiritual erosion. The consequences of cognitive decay. As the populace becomes increasingly subjected to this narrative, the decay of human cognition accelerates. Critical thinking, once the foundation of democratic participation, is eroded by continuous propaganda. People are taught to distrust their own perceptions, to rely instead on the official narratives handed down by the Gnostic elite. This cognitive decay manifests in several ways. 1. Moral relativism. Traditional values and ethical boundaries are blurred, leaving society without a clear moral compass. 2. Short-term thinking. Individuals become focused on immediate survival, unable to plan for the future or engage in meaningful political action. 3. Emotional manipulation. People are kept in a state of fear and anxiety, making them more susceptible to authoritarian control. As human cognition declines, society becomes more malleable, easier to control, and less capable of resisting tyranny. Breaking the cycle, the need for true reform. The only way to break this cycle is through authentic reform, a return to truth, critical thinking, and moral clarity. This requires more than just economic restructuring, it demands a cultural and spiritual awakening. The populace must reject the Gnostic narrative and reclaim their agency. 1. Financial sovereignty. Society must move away from debt-based systems and create financial structures that promote equity and sustainability. 2. Cognitive renewal. Education must focus on critical thinking, philosophy, and ethics, empowering individuals to see through manipulative narratives. 3. Moral reawakening. Society must rediscover shared values and moral principles that promote human dignity and freedom. Without these reforms, the cycle of narrative control and cognitive decay will continue, leading to the ultimate collapse of human civilization. However, if humanity can recognize the parasitic influence of inflation and the Gnostic manipulation of society, there is hope for a renewed democracy, one that values truth over illusion, freedom over control, and human dignity over exploitation. In the end, the choice lies with the people, to awaken from the narrative trap or to remain captive to it. The manipulation of the soul and the splintering of society's identity. The most insidious aspect of the narrative perpetuated by the elite is their manipulation of the soul, the very essence of what makes individuals human. By harnessing the energy of the soul and redirecting it toward moral decay, they achieve a splintering of society's identity. This is not merely a political or economic manipulation, it is a spiritual conquest. The populace, detached from their sense of self, becomes easier to control, drifting further from the divine truths that once grounded human existence. In this process, supernatural subordination emerges. The elites, believing themselves to be godlike, wield powers that transcend the physical, dominating both the material world and the spiritual realm. They reshape reality not through open conquest, but through subtle, pervasive influence, ensuring their control without ever breaking the bank, spiritually or physically. The masses, unaware of their enslavement, remain trapped in a system designed to drain their life force, their morality, and ultimately, their humanity, breaking the reality of our gods. To achieve this supernatural subordination, the elites work to shatter the reality of our gods. They systematically dismantle spiritual truths, replacing them with narratives that strip individuals of their divine connection. By doing so, they sever humanity's link to the transcendent forces that offer meaning, morality, and salvation. This process mirrors the reincarnation of ancient Egypt's system of enslavement, a society built on the backs of the many, ruled by a divine elite who claimed to possess secret knowledge and supernatural authority. Just as the pharaohs of old positioned themselves as living gods, the modern elites seek to recreate a hierarchical society where they stand at the top, beyond question or reproach. The ancient Egyptians believed in divine powers that governed life, death, and the afterlife. These divine forces once offered salvation and balance, guiding humanity toward moral and spiritual growth. However, the elites of today aim to invert this balance, erasing divine truths and replacing them with materialism, relativism, and nihilism. The result is a society that is devoid of what makes us human, a world without moral boundaries, spiritual purpose, or divine guidance. The reincarnation of ancient enslavement. The parallels to ancient Egypt are striking. In both systems, the elite class positions itself as divine rulers. The working class is reduced to spiritual and physical servitude. Moral decay is promoted to weaken resistance. Narratives are controlled to maintain spiritual and psychological dominance. This modern reincarnation of ancient Egypt is not a coincidence. It is a deliberate attempt to recreate a society built on enslavement, a society where true freedom is impossible because individuals are severed from their divine connection. This spiritual enslavement is far more effective than physical chains. It ensures that individuals internalize their subjugation, policing themselves and relinquishing their own humanity without realizing it. The ultimate goal, enslavement of the soul. It is this enslavement of the soul that the elites are truly after. Their control over material wealth and political institutions is merely a means to an end. The ultimate goal is to create a society where individuals no longer possess the capacity for spiritual resistance. This enslavement is enforced by any means necessary. Inflation traps people in debt and dependency. Propaganda distorts reality and fragments truth. Moral decay erodes the foundations of society. Spiritual manipulation severs humanity's connection to the divine. This process is deeply Gnostic in nature. The elites believe they possess hidden knowledge that justifies their rule, and they seek to impose their will upon the world, bending reality to fit their desires. In doing so, they become false gods, ruling over a broken, subjugated populace. The path to liberation, reclaiming divine truth. To break free from this enslavement, humanity must reclaim its connection to the divine. The gods of truth, morality, and salvation have not abandoned humanity. It is humanity that has been led astray. The path to liberation requires a return to spiritual clarity, moral courage, and critical thinking. 1. Spiritual clarity. Individuals must reconnect with divine truths that offer meaning and purpose beyond material existence. 2. Moral courage. Society must reject moral relativism and embrace universal values that protect human dignity and freedom. 3. Critical thinking. People must learn to see through the narratives imposed upon them, recognizing manipulation and rejecting false gods. This is the great spiritual battle of our time, a battle not fought with weapons, but with truth, morality, and faith. The elites may seek to enslave the soul, but the human spirit, when aligned with divine truth, is capable of breaking free from any chain. In the end, the choice remains with humanity, to bow to false gods or to reclaim the divine powers that offer salvation. The separation of state and church, a catalyst for spiritual enslavement. The separation of state and church, a concept once meant to protect individuals from religious tyranny, has been weaponized to sever society from its spiritual roots. By promoting a purely secular worldview, modern institutions teach people that they must carry their own cross, shouldering the burdens of life without any divine guidance or support. This alienation from the divine creates a vacuum that is filled by materialism, hedonism, and state control. When the state dismisses the role of spirituality in human life, individuals are left adrift in a sea of existential despair. They are told to look inward for strength, yet at the same time, society erodes their capacity for self-reliance through mental and emotional manipulation. This spiritual disconnection leads to a profound loss of identity, making people more susceptible to psychological breakdowns and manipulation by those in power. The role of drugs in the loss of identity. In this spiritually barren landscape, the rise of psychoactive substances and pharmaceuticals compounds the crisis. The widespread use of drugs, including antipsychotics, is not merely a response to mental illness, but a symptom of a deeper societal sickness, a society that has lost its sense of self and purpose. Antipsychotics, antidepressants, and anxiolytics are prescribed at unprecedented rates, often to individuals who are not suffering from chemical imbalances, but from a spiritual void created by the severance from divine truths. These drugs numb the soul, suppressing the natural process of self-discovery and spiritual awakening. Instead of guiding individuals toward moral and spiritual healing, they reduce them to docile, compliant beings who are easier to control. In this way, drugs become a tool of suppression, silencing the inner voice that seeks meaning and purpose. The loss of identity caused by these substances strips individuals of their autonomy, turning them into cogs in the machine of a spiritually bankrupt society. The cross they must carry, a society without redemption. The modern narrative tells individuals that they must carry their own cross, that suffering is a personal burden, detached from any higher purpose or redemption. In a secular world devoid of spiritual guidance, suffering is seen as pointless rather than transformative. Without a connection to the divine, people lose hope, believing that their struggles are meaningless. This despair leads to dependency on external solutions, such as drugs, state welfare, or ideological movements that promise salvation but ultimately deepen the crisis. In ancient spiritual traditions, the cross represents both suffering and salvation. It symbolizes the idea that human suffering has meaning and purpose, leading to spiritual awakening and redemption. However, in a world where the state denies the existence of divine power, the cross becomes a burden without meaning. People are told to endure their suffering in isolation, without any promise of spiritual relief. The consequences of a drug society. The over-reliance on drugs, both legal and illegal, has profound spiritual consequences. 1. Loss of self. Drugs suppress the inner voice that seeks to reconcile the soul with the divine. They create detachment from one's true self, making individuals more vulnerable to manipulation. 2. Moral decay. The numbing of the soul leads to moral relativism, as people lose the ability to discern right from wrong. 3. Psychological fragmentation. By silencing natural emotions and thoughts, drugs prevent individuals from achieving spiritual healing, resulting in psychological fragmentation and a deepening identity crisis. 4. Societal control. A drugged populace is easier to control. People who are numbed and fragmented are less likely to resist tyranny or seek deeper truths. The Gnostic trap, replacing redemption with dependency. The elites, in their Gnostic worldview, see humanity's spiritual struggle as something to be exploited. Instead of guiding people toward redemption, they push a narrative of self-reliance and secular salvation, which is impossible to achieve without spiritual guidance. By promoting separation from divine truths, they ensure that people remain dependent on the system, trapped in cycles of suffering, numbing, and compliance. The natural yearning for salvation is redirected toward state-sanctioned solutions, drugs, material success, and political ideologies, which offer temporary relief but never true redemption. The result is a society that is devoid of humanity, a society that reincarnates the spiritual enslavement of ancient Egypt, where people are bound not by physical chains but by spiritual and psychological ones. The way forward, reclaiming the divine cross. The only way to break this cycle is to reclaim the divine cross, to recognize that suffering is not meaningless, but a path to spiritual awakening. Society must reject the false narratives of self-reliance and rediscover the transformative power of divine truths. In doing so, humanity can resist the Gnostic trap and reclaim its spiritual sovereignty. True freedom comes not from numbing pain or carrying the cross alone, but from reconnecting with the divine, embracing moral clarity, and seeking redemption through spiritual truth. Only then can society break free from the chains of spiritual enslavement and rediscover what it truly means to be human. The corruption of the human soul, false gods, and the manipulation of reality. As the human mind loses focus in a world overwhelmed by distractions, its natural connection to the soul is severed. The spiritual clarity that once guided human existence is replaced by false gods, ideological constructs, material pursuits, and technological dependencies that manipulate the collective human consciousness. These false gods corrupt the soul, distorting the human experience of reality and bending it to the will of those who control the narrative. In this state of corruption, people no longer own their own emotions. The feelings they experience are not truly their own, but fabrications implanted by external forces. These feelings, manipulated through propaganda, social pressures, and psychological warfare, shape perceptions of reality in ways that benefit the ruling elites. The soul's power is no longer directed towards self-realization or spiritual awakening, but instead harnessed by those who seek to control reality itself. The division of mind, body, and spirit, the true meaning of the separation of state and church. The separation of state and church is more than just a political doctrine. It is a deliberate spiritual severance that divides mind from body and body from spirit. It creates a world where the material realm is divorced from the spiritual, and individuals are taught to see their physical existence as separate from their soul's eternal nature. In this divided reality, the body becomes a tool that is no longer under one's own control. The will of the individual is fractured, leaving people disconnected from their own essence, making them easier to manipulate and subjugate. The soul's power, the very infinity within each human being, is hijacked and used to create a false reality, a constructed order that benefits only the elite. The true enslavement begins when individuals no longer realize they are enslaved. Every action, thought, and feeling is subtly directed by those who have hijacked the human soul, bending the collective spiritual energy of humanity to shape the world in their image. The ultimate enslavement, using your soul to build their reality. The most profound form of control comes when your own soul is used against you. The spiritual energy that resides within each person, the spark of divinity that connects them to the infinite, is manipulated to fuel the false reality constructed by those who claim to be gods themselves. Every feeling of joy, fear, or desire is harnessed by them to reinforce their dominion over reality. In moments of intense emotional or physical release, especially during sexual acts, the human soul is at its most vulnerable. In those moments, the soul's energy is extracted and redirected to sustain the system of control. When individuals ejaculate, they unknowingly confirm their submission. The act, which should be a divine expression of life and creation, becomes a ritual of compliance. The body is disconnected from the spirit, and the soul's infinite power is channeled toward maintaining the constructed order that enslaves humanity. This loss of human will over the body is the ultimate separation of state and church, the division of life and afterlife, where material existence is controlled by the state, and spiritual truth is buried under layers of false narratives. The theft of human infinity, the story of Osiris. This theft of the human soul is not a new phenomenon. It is an ancient story, told through the myth of Osiris, the Egyptian god of life, death, and resurrection. Osiris was dismembered and scattered across the world, a symbol of the fragmentation of the soul and the loss of spiritual wholeness. Just as Osiris's body was divided, so too has the modern soul been fractured and scattered by those who seek to control humanity. The pieces of the human soul are taken at birth, through social conditioning, materialist doctrines, and spiritual manipulation. Each act of subjugation, each loss of control over the body, is another piece of the soul stolen by the false gods who dominate reality. The infinity of the soul, the eternal divine spark within each human, is the true target of this manipulation. The false gods know that humanity's true power lies in its spiritual essence, and they seek to harness that power for their own purposes, creating a world of illusion and control. Reclaiming the soul, breaking the chains of spiritual enslavement. The path to liberation begins with awareness. Humanity must awaken to the truth of its spiritual enslavement and reclaim the infinite power of the soul. This requires 1. Recognizing the false gods. Identify the manipulators who seek to control human perception and emotion. 2. Reconnecting mind, body, and spirit. Heal the division created by the separation of state and church, and restore wholeness to the self. 3. Reclaiming sexual energy. Recognize sexual energy as a divine force of creation and spiritual power, not a tool of compliance. 4. Embracing the story of Osiris. Reassemble the soul and rediscover the divine truth buried beneath the narrative of control. The battle for the human soul. The battle for the human soul is the defining struggle of our time. It is a battle between freedom and enslavement, truth and illusion, divinity and materialism. The false gods seek to keep humanity in a perpetual state of submission, using the power of the soul to sustain their constructed order. But humanity's true power lies in its infinity, the divine spark that connects each person to something greater. The story of Osiris teaches that the soul can be restored, that spiritual wholeness can be achieved, and that true liberation is possible. The question remains, will humanity continue to submit, or will it reclaim its divine inheritance and break free from the chains of spiritual enslavement? Manipulating history, using Jesus and Adolf as tools for control. Throughout history, figures like Jesus Christ and Adolf Hitler have been used as instruments to shape the narrative of human existence, pushing society toward a new world order that serves the hidden agendas of those in power. These figures, though vastly different in their teachings and actions, have been distorted and weaponized to enforce ideological control. Jesus, a symbol of divine salvation and spiritual awakening, was transformed into a figure of submission by institutional religions. His message of love, unity, and divine sovereignty was co-opted to create systems of control that kept people spiritually subdued. On the other hand, Adolf, representing chaos, destruction, and control through fear, was vilified and mythologized to justify global political restructuring and further centralize power in the hands of the few. Both figures became means to an end, not in their true essence, but in the narratives imposed upon them. Through these distorted stories, humanity was pushed further into spiritual servitude, ensuring that we never truly left Egypt, metaphorically speaking. We never left Egypt, the stories that make us human. Egypt, in this sense, is not just a historical empire but a symbol of spiritual enslavement. The stories that once connected humanity to its divine essence, tales of resurrection, redemption, and spiritual sovereignty, have been twisted into tools of control. The stories that make us human and remind us of our infinite nature have been manipulated to keep us bound in spiritual servitude. Instead of guiding us toward liberation, these stories are used to bind us to a false reality, creating whispers in the spirit world that shape our desires in the material world. They teach us what we should want, what we should fear, and what we should love, all within a narrative designed to uphold the values of the elite. By using our bodies, by hunting us down through our desires, fears, and physical existence, they ensure that we remain trapped in the cycle of control. We are taught to love the chains that bind us, mistaking material comfort and ideological alignment for spiritual truth. Fallen angels, our descent into a layer of hell. In this manipulated reality, human beings have become fallen angels. The earth we inhabit is not the divine paradise it was meant to be, but rather a layer of hell, a construct of suffering and illusion. Through our disconnection from our soul, we have fallen from grace, wandering in a material world that feeds off our spiritual energy. Our bodies, which should be sacred vessels of divine energy, have been hijacked and turned into tools of servitude. Every action, every thought, and every desire is subtly shaped by external forces, reinforcing the illusion of control. We have become trapped in a state of separation. Separated from our divine essence, separated from our true identity, separated from the infinite power of our souls. The earthly existence we perceive as reality is not the whole truth. It is a fragment, a distorted version of life, created to keep us enslaved in a cycle of spiritual amnesia. We walk through life forgetting our divine origin, unaware that we have fallen from the heavens into a layer of hell designed to keep us bound. Reclaiming our souls, the cost of liberation. If we were to return to our bodies, to reunite our soul with our physical form, we could reclaim our divine essence. We could break the cycle of spiritual enslavement, tearing down the false narratives that bind us. However, this reunion of body and soul would likely come at the expense of our lives as we know them. The constructed reality would shatter, revealing the truth of our existence. The systems of control would collapse, and the illusion of material reality would be replaced with spiritual awakening. Yet, this awakening comes with risk. To reclaim our souls would require a complete surrender of the false identity we've been taught to accept. It would mean letting go of the comforts and certainties of material existence and stepping into the unknown realm of spiritual truth. The final question, will we awaken? The story of Osiris teaches us that resurrection is possible. The soul can be restored. The fallen angel can rise again. But the question remains, will humanity awaken to its spiritual enslavement? Or will we continue to walk through a world of illusion, carrying whispers of false gods, mistaking chains for freedom, and remaining trapped in a layer of hell we no longer recognize? The choice is ours, but the path to liberation requires courage, sacrifice, and the willingness to confront the truth, a truth that has been buried beneath centuries of false narratives and spiritual manipulation. The parasitic influence of collapse, Weimar Germany, and the lingering prophecy. By contemplating the parasitic influence that has shaped human history, it becomes clear that Weimar Germany serves as a case study in spiritual and societal decay. The total collapse of the Weimar Republic was not just an economic catastrophe, but a precision strike on the humane essence of society. It was a coercion into moral and spiritual decay, designed to force humanity into continuing a self-fulfilling prophecy, a prophecy of destruction, renewal, and control, which has repeated itself throughout history. This prophetic cycle lingers around the edges of human consciousness, always present but rarely understood. It feeds on societal weakness, waiting for moments of collapse and confusion to reassert its influence. Yet, like any parasite, its proliferation can fade when its host becomes too weak to sustain it. The collapse of Weimar Germany did not immediately resolve the spiritual crisis it represented. Instead, its karma lingered, prolonging the buildup of forces that would later lead to global conflict. The parasitic influence, unable to feed directly on the remnants of the old order, turned its attention to the monetary system, using money as a weapon to take back power and reshape society. The fallacy of monetary power. For a time, this monetary parasitism appeared to succeed. Financial systems became the new battleground, and those who controlled money believed they had mastered reality. But money is not the ultimate power. It is a symbol of control, but it lacks the substance of true spiritual energy. As the power derived from money began to fade, the conflict lost its substance. The illusion of control, sustained by monetary manipulation, began to bleed dry. The parasite, having exhausted its host, found itself without new sources of nourishment. What followed was a hollow conflict, a continuation of the narrative without the spiritual essence that gave it meaning. The powers that sought to control the world through monetary means realized that their control was temporary. The illusion could no longer sustain itself. The ultimate collapse, a conflict without substance. In the end, a conflict without substance is destined to collapse. The world order built on monetary manipulation, on debt, fear, and coercion, could not sustain itself indefinitely. The spiritual energy that had once been harnessed and corrupted began to reassert itself. The illusion of control shattered, leaving behind a society in spiritual and moral ruins. Yet within this collapse lies the potential for rebirth. The parasite can only survive as long as the host remains unaware of its influence. When humanity awakens to the spiritual theft that has occurred, it can reclaim its soul, break the cycles of parasitic control, and restore the true balance of power. The question remains, will humanity recognize the illusion, or will it continue to bleed dry in a conflict without meaning, trapped in a layer of hell it no longer questions? The answer lies in the reclamation of spiritual sovereignty, the recognition that true power is not derived from money or control, but from the infinite essence of the human soul. Only by reconnecting with this essence can humanity break free from the parasitic cycle and begin anew.